On a cold November night in 1975, a ship once hailed as the largest freighter on the lakes vanished into the dark waters of Lake Superior without a single distress call. I see it going right across my deck here now. She was the Edmund Fitzgerald, the most celebrated and one of the safest freighters of her time. Strong, state-of-the-art, and commanded by one of the most experienced captains on the lakes. Yet in one violent storm she and her 29-man crew disappeared without a trace. What brought down this mighty ship? Was it rogue waves, a hidden reef, or something deep within the Fitzgerald herself? 50 years later, and the legend lives on. The mystery remains. This is the story of her life, her loss, and the men who never came. This is the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the full story on Part-Time Explorer. Music. Applause. For such a heavy video about a tragedy that still carries significant emotional weight for families and friends of those who were lost, we've decided not to accept a sponsor for this video. But we do want to thank our supporters on Patreon for helping make this documentary financially possible. Can visit my Patreon at the link in the description below. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald has haunted the Great Lakes for half a century. 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of when she was lost. And with that, we look back not only on the mystery of her loss, but at the world that she belonged. A world of steel giants, treacherous waters, and the men who tamed them. The 50 years since she was lost, countless theories have been suggested as to why she went down. But none can be proven. No matter how heated the debates, we simply don't know how this behemoth vanished. But we're going to look at this wreck closely, relying on experts who have studied this wreck since the night the ship went down. My name is Frederick Stonehouse. I am a maritime historian. I taught maritime history at Northern Michigan University, and have authored a somewhat north of 30 different publications that deal with maritime history either on the Great Lakes or open ocean. Fred Stonehouse has researched the ship extensively for 50 years and has been involved in every single expedition to the wreck to some degree. We're also working with a unique digital model to enhance the animations that we frequently work with on these projects. The base of our Edmund Fitzgerald model was made by engineering students at Clemson University under the guidance of programming wizard Jerry Tessendorf. I developed something that these days the buzzword for it is a digital twin that sort of simulates environments. We finished off the model and will be giving back our complete asset to the university as a thank you for their help. Music. You cannot look closely at the Edmund Fitzgerald without traveling to her physically. Whitefish Point, Michigan, is the closest spot to where she went down and is home to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. The museum has generously opened up their collection and materials to us. With these factors, and our crew's general expertise in maritime history, we're taking a new look at the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. To understand the Fitzgerald, we must first understand the stage that she sailed upon. The Great Lakes are inland seas, vast stretches of fresh water, where storms rise with the fury of oceans. Waves here break with the same power as those on the Atlantic or the Pacific, and those who sail them know that November brings the most violent tempests of all. The lakes are a highway of industry transporting goods and raw material long distances between factory ports in the United States and Canada. Our story begins in the 1950s with the dream of opening these Great Lakes to the rest of the world. At the time, the Great St. Lawrence Seaway was under construction. Now, this project had been talked about for decades but was finally underway and nearing completion by 1957. This large project was a series of canals and channels that enabled large, deep-draft vessels to travel between the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, which would then link the lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. In the 1950s, the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee some music at them and gave them a whistle salute. This had a lasting impression on the two kids, who from then on referred to the captain as the happy captain of the happy boat. The family managed to come in contact with the captain, who invited them to tour the ship that October. They walked the entire vessel, having a grand time, and took lunch in the captain's cabin. Captain Pulsar loaded the kids up with souvenirs as they left, and a memory that they would always cherish. Captain Pulsar retired in 1972, and command of the Edmund Fitzgerald was taken over by Captain Ernest Msurley. Just like in the sailing days of old, it was common for captains and officers to bring their wives on voyages with them. They might quilt on the wheelhouse or bake cakes in the galley, adding a wonderful touch of home to those long voyages, with some of the sailors not seeing their homes all season. The wives even furnished wonderful holiday meals, such as this fine spread laid out for Thanksgiving aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. For a freighter, the Fitz sure was comfortable, with all sorts of modern amenities provided for her crew. As mentioned earlier, the Fitzgerald had passenger accommodations. Usually, if you were to sail on the Fitzgerald as a passenger, it was as a guest of one of the companies connected with the ship, or as family of the crew or something like that. If it could be a captain's wife or an officer's wife that accompanied that particular trip. It could be a corporate man from the company headquarters that was taking the trip with his family. It likewise could be a businessman that had a relationship with the shipping company in some regard that was offered a trip on the boat. The passengers had their own dining room in the starboard aft corner of the after-deck house, and once per voyage the captain was known to do a fine dinner by candle lights with special cocktails. Passengers soon fell into the rhythm of the lakes as the big ship drove onward. It would be something you do in late spring, midsummer, to enjoy the great lakes that we have, and what you're seeing and what you're doing, and more importantly, almost getting with the rhythm of the Great Lakes. Takes a few days to do that, to settle down to a nice boat trip on a great big freighter. She was as comfortable as an ocean liner. The passenger accommodations on Fitzgerald were considered to be probably the best in the fleet. Certainly among the best of the Great Lakes vessels. I don't say that lightly. There were 135 vessels in the U.S. fleet, so the competition could be a little fierce for who had the best. It wasn't all celebrations and fine dining with the Edmund Fitzgerald, though. She had a few structural problems that were fixed during her winter layups. She also bumped into the walls of the Soo locks a few times and once grounded. In another incident, she collided with the freighter Ocealaga, sustaining minor damage. Seems that every recorded incident during the ship's early career happened at or near Soo locks. But these incidents are insignificant to a ship like the Fitzgerald. If compared to driving a car, they might be a crack in a windshield or a flat tire. Easily fixed and not really a concern. In fact, the Fitzgerald was known as one of the safest ships on the lakes, winning awards for being well run and working without a single incident that resulted in injury during her first several years of service. The ship set record after record, regularly besting its own records for heaviest cargo carried on the Great Lakes, most cargo carried during the season, and fastest voyages, in addition to its safety record. Fitzgerald was the triumphant hero of the Great Lakes, the MVP, a ship that sailors truly served on with pride. I don't make these sweeping claims lightly, to boost the ship's status or to add drama to the tale. Her reputation was regularly talked about in the newspapers of the 1960s. In 1969, a bow thruster was installed to give the ship greater maneuverability in port, essentially eliminating the need for a tugboat to help the ship dock, resulting in the fastest and biggest ship of the lakes now being able to turn around in port significantly faster. The tail end of 1971, during her winter layup, her boilers were converted from coal burning to oil burning. On January 7, 1974, right by downtown Detroit, the Fitzgerald had another little accident, and she lost her starboard anchor, which dropped down into the water and was left there. 30 years later, the anchor was rediscovered. by divers and eventually recovered, and now sits outside the Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Bell Island. Throughout her career, the Coast Guard adjusted the permitted load line for the Fitzgerald, ultimately reducing her legal freeboard by over 3 foot down to less than 12 feet now. The Fitzgerald was permitted to sail with additional cargo and lower in the water. This reduction was done because the Coast Guard felt that the Fitzgerald was safer than initially believed, but these reductions did make her more vulnerable to larger waves and breaking seas. Other than that, as the ship worked its way through its 1975 season, she was very much the same vessel as when she was built 17 years prior. 17 years isn't old by any means with these lake freighters. The fresh water of the lakes, combined with the advanced engineering put into the construction of these vessels, means that they could, with proper care, stay in service indefinitely. The Herbert C. Jackson, for example, is very similar to the Fitzgerald structurally and was built 1 year after the Fitz. At nearly 70 years old today, she's still in service. So the Fitzgerald at 17 years old was still considered quite young. Preparations for the final voyage. Music. October 31, 1975. An inspection of the spar deck was made on the Eden Fitzgerald as it laid over in Toledo, Ohio, in order to best assess what repair work would need to be done over her winter layup that year. There were no serious issues found with the ship. Anything needed work was considered to just be routine as the result of wear and tear. The most notable fault in the ship, however, was the number 4 hatch. There were cracks and gashes. These were considered insignificant. Sure, it could allow water to enter, but the ship had pumps that were designed to keep up with the hatch leaks. The hatches weren't even waterproof, so the ship was built to be able to take a little bit of water through the hatches. She had 6 different pumps, 2 different types. She was well equipped to pump water out of her holds and her ballast tanks. The Fitzgerald was permitted to finish the season before these problems were addressed, since there were really only about 2 weeks left before winter would set in. The season was drawing to a close. It's usually around mid-November, when the skies turn gloomy when the winter winds roll onto the Great Lakes, marking the end of safe passage on the lakes for the year. By far, November is the worst time to be on the Great Lakes, followed by October and, of course, September as the fall builds up. Sometimes it's been referred to as the Witch of November, but it truly is the worst time to be moving cargo or boating in any way on the especially Lake Superior. Music. Another voyage and a half later, the Eden Fitzgerald was docked at the Burlington Northern Railroad Dock No. 1. This dock right here still standing today. Although she often morrowed at mining plants like Silver Bay on her first voyage, she frequently came along massive ore docks like these where she was loaded with taconite pellets. Billions of these pellets were hauled from the mines down to the lake and brought out onto these ore docks by train. The Fitzgerald would position itself alongside the dock and chutes would lower down over each of the open hatchways. A crewman would stand on deck and give hand signals to guide the ship to be perfectly aligned with these ore chutes. Long trains of hoppers would continuously move up onto the ore dock and dump the pellets into these chambers, the trains moving in and out as the ships filled. When a chamber was spent, the ship would move down the dock, working its way along. Music. Slowly over the course of 4 or 5 hours, ore would fill all 3 holds of the ship until she sat low in the water. Iron ore was loaded into the ship as usual, 26,116 tons of it in the form of taconite pellets. It was a heavy load, but not a record breaker. This was likely to be the Fitzgerald's final voyage of the season. Storms were brewing to the south, making their way north. The Fitzgerald would travel down to Detroit, drop off the cargo, and begin her winter layover in Toledo. The weather on Lake Superior was beautiful on November 9th. The storm is brewing. But 700 miles away, a fierce storm was brewing. The storm formed in central Kansas on November 9th, 1975, and rapidly began to move to the northeast. Although it doesn't have an eye or anything like that, you can kind of think of this farm center, and the motion is sort of counterclockwise a little bit, like our larger storm systems are. At the moment that the Edmonton sheriff was planning to leave Bore, it was that the storm was still in the Midwest, and it was forecast to move up north and take a path that was east of Lake Superior, and in fact it did not go east of Lake Superior, went right over Lake Superior, and so the wind pattern from it was very different from what the forecast was. She was over central Lake Superior the following day, packing some really ferocious winds. Some of the winds on the open lake were clocked at over 90 miles per hour. Now remember, a Category 1 hurricane is 74 m an hour. So these were truly hurricane winds. The Weather Service, of course, does not recognize hurricanes on the Great Lakes, so that term in connection with the Fitzgerald is very rarely used. But it was a vicious time on the lake. Some of the waves reported in excess of 40 feet. The Weather Service admitted to waves in excess of 25 feet, so it truly was a bad storm. Though it was not nearly the worst of the storms that ever struck the lakes. Go back to 1913, November 13th, when the great blow of that year came through that quite literally wrecked 47 different vessels on the Great Lakes, killed 250 sailors, sank 9 modern steel iron ore carriers with all hands and locations unidentified. Only this year was the last one of them. The Courthers finally found. This storm, now brewing in Kansas, was projected to miss Lake Superior, but the weather agency was terribly wrong. The storms that generate out of the southwest are really the nastiest ones. Every time that there's been a big storm in the lake, that's where it came from. The final voyage. At 2:15 p.m. November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald pulled away from dock Number 1, making its way out of the harbor and into Lake Superior, bound for Zoo Island, Detroit. Music. No passengers for this voyage, but her crew was made up of 29 men. No one on board would be seen alive again. The best testimony of the following tale comes from the closest witnesses to the story. The crew of the freighter Arthur M. Anderson. The captain of the Anderson was Bernie Cooper, on watch with his officers in the wheelhouse. An often overlooked detail of this voyage is that there actually is a woman on board the Anderson as well. The chief engineer's wife was making a trip, and she spent about 6 hours with her life jacket on in an all-hallway 'cause the seas were so big. Around this time, the Anderson had just left Two Harbors, Minnesota, carrying a load of taconite pellets bound for Gary, Indiana, which means the ship would follow the exact same route as the Fitzgerald for most of the way at least. When we left, it was the most beautiful day you ever saw in your life. She steamed into the lake and soon spotted the Fitzgerald about 15 miles ahead of her as the day was ending. At about 7 p.m. that evening, the first warning of gale force winds was issued as a storm was approaching. Whenever you start to get gale warnings, the word goes around the ship. We call all the galley, we call the engineers, and you send your forward end crew on to dog everything down to make sure everything is tight. You check your clamps on your deck. Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson got on his radio and called the Eden Fitzgerald to establish contact and discuss these weather warnings. Throughout the night, the weather deteriorated. Winds intensified to 52 knots, officially storm force winds, and wave heights were reaching 10 feet, nearly cresting over the Fitzgerald's decks. Around 2 a.m., Captain Cooper radioed the Fitzgerald to once more discuss the weather and determine the best course of action. Usually, the American freighters sailed along the southern route through Lake Superior, the fastest channel between Superior and the Soo Locks of Sault Ste. Marie. However, they were more exposed to the weather down there. There was a longer but more sheltered route to the north, which would eventually take them into Canadian waters. After a brief discussion, Captains Cooper and Surley agreed the northern longer route was the best option given the weather warnings. The two vessels adjusted course. There must have been a concern among the crews. The Fitzgerald picked up speed and began pulling away from the Anderson, hoping to stay ahead of the weather. The Anderson was only able to keep pace by cutting corners off of their course, but she was still falling behind. The waves pounded the two ships, steaming forward in the darkness. Dawn broke with the ships still on their rough course. The wind subsided throughout the morning, but the waves persisted. Between 1 and 2 in the afternoon, the two vessels passed Misshapicotten Island, near the Canadian shore of the eastern side of the lake, steaming south-southeast, towards the Sioux Locks, still over a 100 m ahead. The storm had calmed significantly, but it was expected to regain strength shortly with winds coming from the west. Before the ships would reach the Sioux Locks, they'd enter a more sheltered part of the lake called Whitefish Bay, defined by a large peninsula jutting into Lake Superior called Whitefish Point. So just around this point is Whitefish Bay, and that was a very common shelter for storms because the whole peninsula of Whitefish Point protects the bay over there. The storms come up from this way, and the land mass sort of provides a bit of a shelter or a shield from that. If the ships could at least round Whitefish Point Peninsula into the shelter of the bay, they'd be able to bunker down and weather the storm. They just had 90 m to go. Captain Cooper once more called the Fitzgerald on the radio and spoke with Captain Surley. Cooper reported that he'd be shifting his ship so